Hi everyone. So today we're going to be looking at water and mineral nutrition, two things very important for our plants. So before we get into it, let's briefly review plant propagation, and then we'll jump right into this lecture. Okay, so last week we talked about plant propagation. And again, all plant propagation is increasing plant numbers or creating new plants. And within this field, we have two types. We have seed propagation and we have vegetative propagation. Now, seed propagation is sexual reproduction of our plants. And we talked about sexual reproduction, mixes of genes. As a result, when we are talking about plants that are reproducing by seed, we may have lines which will breed true, right? So the offspring will have the same characteristics as the adult plants that we've bred together. And typically their genes, their genotype is very homozygous, right? They have the same alleles. Or we could have hybrid seed, which are heterozygous, so they have different alleles, and these won't breed true. But hybrid seed is very important. There's something that is called hybrid vigor, in which these hybrid seeds have better characteristics than the homozygous seeds. Now, our seeds typically start off as dormant, and there's different types of dormancy. So we have exogenous or external dormancy, and I talked about a hardened seed coat. Or you have endogenous dormancy, which is something related to the embryo that keeps it dormant. Different ways of alleviating this dormancy for external or exogenous dormancy, where you have this hardened seed coat. You could do scarification, so you could do mechanical, so essentially like rubbing to break up the seed coat with sandpaper, anything. You could do an acid treatment or a heat treatment to start breaking down that seed coat. For endogenous dormancy, you're going to do stratification, so that's that cold stratification, and depending on the species, it may need to be under stratification for different lengths of time. All right? So that's seed propagation. And then we had vegetative propagation. And this is asexual. So we are creating clones, right? All of the propagules or the progeny plants are going to have the exact same genotype as the adults or as the parent plants or plant. And vegetative propagation is all based on these vegetative or adventitious organs, right? So these are stems or roots that are forming anywhere other than those main stem or root tissues, right? So if you have a cut stem and you have roots that form from that cut stem, those would be adventitious roots. Or if you have a piece of root and you have a stem that forms from that piece of root, that would be an adventitious shoot. All right, so that's really important. So in vegetative propagations, there's a couple different types or a couple different techniques. You have cuttings, in which you are just taking a piece of the plant, either a root or a stem or even a leaf, and you're planting that, and from that you're growing adventitious organs. Grafting, in which you're combining two plants to essentially make a Frankenstein type plant. You have layering, in which it's a type of cutting, but you essentially set up a system so what is going to ultimately be your cutting or propagule will grow adventitious organs while it's still attached to the mother plant. And then there's micropropagation, in which you're using small pieces of plant tissue to create new plants, and this is done typically in a lab. So obviously plants need water. We've talked about water already kind of throughout this course. And water is important for a number of things, right? It's one of the main requirements for seed germination. It's that first step. The seed imbibes water, takes in water. Water is important and required for photosynthesis, which we are going to be learning next week. It provides structural support to the plant. Remember, it is used to maintain turgor pressure, right? Water is taken into the central vacuoles, pushes the cell membrane against the cell wall, maintains that turgor pressure. It helps transport minerals and photosynthate throughout the plant, and it's part of the plant's structure. Water is approximately 90% of a plant's mass, right? So water is essential for our plants. What we're going to be looking at in this lecture then are the properties of water, how those properties and some other factors affect the availability of water in the soil for plants, because plants take up water through their roots. And then how does that process actually work, right? How do plants absorb and conduct water throughout themselves? So we're going to start by looking at the properties of water. And perhaps the most important property that water has that we see here is what is referred to as polarity. So polarity means essentially that one end of the water molecule has a positive charge while the other end has a negative charge. And this polarity is going to result in some kind of interesting properties that water has, right? One of the first being cohesion. So water molecules are attracted to each other. This is as a result of that polarity that you see here, where the positive end, think of it kind of like a magnet, the positive end is attracted to the negative end, right? And what forms between this attraction is what we refer to as a hydrogen bond. It's a bond that forms between the positive end and the negative end of water molecules. And this force of cohesion acts to really attract and hold water molecules together, right? You see these droplets here. It's cohesion that is forming, that is maintaining this droplet, right? These water molecules are attracted to each other. Now, this polarity also results in what we refer to as adhesion. So our water molecules are attracted to each other, but they are also attracted to other unlike molecules, right? So not just other water molecules, they can also be attracted to minerals or soil particles, etc. Right? Because other molecules may also have charges, either positive or negative, that can attract these water molecules. All right, so here's our water molecule, and here we see that these water molecules are attracted to a clay mineral material that has a negative charge, again, due to this process of polarity. And this is referred to as adhesion. Right? And a good example is here, if we're looking at raindrops, it's cohesion that causes the formation of those drops that we see here, and it's adhesion that causes the drops to cling to surfaces, right? If we're looking at this leaf blade, cohesion has made these drops, and adhesion is keeping those drops stuck to the leaf blade right there. Right, so two important things, all due to that polarity of a water molecule. The fact that it has positive charge on one end, negative charge on the other. Now, when we are talking about water movement is affected by both that adhesion and cohesion, and we refer to this as matric potential, and it's also affected by gravity. So if we're looking at an irrigation canal like we may have in a farm field, gravity is going to pull that water downward, right? And those water molecules are attracted to each other, so they're going to continually to move down. But we also have adhesion and cohesion that may work to move this water laterally across the field as well, right? There may be whatever minerals are in this soil may have a particular charge, negative or positive charge, and that's going to attract these water molecules in this direction as well. And as those molecules are attracted, they essentially drag along other molecules that are attracted to them through that cohesion, right? Other water molecules are attracted to those molecules. They form those hydrogen bonds. So if we are thinking about how water is going to move through soil, for instance, these are factors that we need to be aware of, this adhesion and cohesion, as well as gravity. Now, water movement can also be affected by positive and negative pressure. Right? We think of positive pressure as an example. Here's like a long irrigation tube that you're pumping water through, and as you're pumping water, that is creating positive pressure. It's pushing the water through the tube, and then you have a series of holes that the water is going to flow out. So that's positive pressure, where we're pushing water through a tube, essentially, or pushing water. And the opposite of that is negative pressure. And the example we have here is, think of sucking water up through a straw, right? You are sucking up through the straw, you're removing that air, it creates this vacuum that's going to pull water up through the straw into your mouth, right? And that is negative pressure. That's going to pull water. So just like with our adhesion and cohesion and gravity, that's going to affect water movement. We also have water that is affected through positive and negative pressure, as well as osmotic pressure. So osmosis is the flow of water through a membrane from a solution with low solute concentration to a solution with high solute concentration. You've probably heard of osmosis or learned about it in chemistry, most likely. But here's the example right up here. Right, so we have water. This is a semi-permeable membrane, like a cell membrane is. And if we have an instance where we have different concentrations of solute, and that solute is anything that dissolves in water, or so that could be like salts or minerals, etc. If you have a high concentration on one side and a lower concentration on the other side, through this process of osmosis, water is going to move from the where you have a lower concentration of that solute to a higher concentration. Right? It's trying to even things out. So osmosis is very important because osmosis is actually the process by which water enters the root. Right? And remember, the water is entering the root through those root hairs attached to the root. Why this is also important is, as we're going to see, it's the process by which water enters the root. But when we talk about fertilizer, fertilizer ions are solutes. So there is what can occur if you are applying too much fertilizer, if you over-fertilize plants or an area, you can get what's called fertilizer burn on your plants. And what's happening there is that you are, by adding so many ions to the soil, you're creating this situation where the water is now going to flow from the plant back from the roots back into the soil, or prevent water from moving into the plant because your solute concentration is too high here. If this is the outside, your solute concentration is be too high over in this instance, and water's not able to flow into the root. So that's referred to as fertilizer burn. You can see it here as kind of this you see the senescence or the death of like the edges of leaves, right? So, kind of putting this all together, what ultimately is going to determine the direction of water flow is what we refer to as water potential. Now, water potential itself is determined by those factors that we talked about: adhesion, cohesion, osmosis, positive and negative pressure. And when you combine them all, what is important to remember is that water is going to flow from an area that has high water potential to an area that has low water potential. And again, that water potential is made up of these different things that we talked about. So that's kind of how the basics of how water moves. Right? Now, another important thing that we need to be aware of is water availability. So we know how water is going to move through a system or move through soil. What determines how much water is available in that soil? Well, the main factor is the texture of your soil. So all of your soils are composed of different size diameter particles. Right? It's essentially a mixture of sand, silt, and clay, with sand having the largest particles and clay having the smaller particles. So those the size of the particles affects the pore spaces, and it's within these pore spaces that water is held. So if you look at sand here with these big pore spaces, that leaves a lot of gaps, and it allows water to flow through a very sandy soil quickly. And you compare that with a clay soil where there's very, very small gaps. In this situation, water is held in the soil much more than a sandy soil, right? So it's this proportion of these different textures that is ultimately going to determine how much water is available in your soil through time. With sandy soils having less water generally, because that water moves through the big pores, and clay soils holding water much more frequently. Now, for agriculture, you generally want to find like a loamy soil. right? And that loamy soil has an even mixture of clay, silt, and sand. So it's going to hold water, but it doesn't hold too much water that you might see with a clay soil, where conditions can become anoxic, where you can or anaerobic, where you no longer have oxygen in your soil as well, right? So those pore spaces hold soil, but they also hold oxygen, which is important for our plants. So you don't want something where there's too much water holding capacity that you may see in a wetland environment, but you don't want it too sandy where all that water is going to drain out right after it rains. So you want a nice loamy soil in the middle. Another thing to be aware of is field capacity and wilting point. So as your soil dries, it rains, right? And your soil gets saturated. So all the pore spaces get filled with water. Now, and that we refer to that as saturation. Now, some of that water is going to be lost due to gravity, and we get to a point that we refer to as field capacity. And field capacity is the point where your pore spaces are filled with water, and that is the maximum water that could be available for your plants, right? Now, eventually, as your soil dries, you can get to a point called wilting point. And at this wilting point, no more water is available to your plants. Now, there may still be water in your soil, but due to that process of adhesion, right, where our water molecules are attracted to other molecules, in this case, they will be attracted to these soil particles, that adhesion is too strong, that water is too attracted to the soil particles that it can't be taken up by the plant. And we refer to this as the wilting point. And so if we are talking about the water that is available for plant growth, it would be your field capacity, so the amount of water that is available once it is saturated, right, minus the wilting point. Okay, so that's a little background on how the factors that affect water movement, what makes water available in your soil, right, and the things that affect water availability. The next big thing is, how do our plants absorb and conduct water? And if you think about some of our giant trees, like our sequoias or our redwoods, they are these huge, huge trees. How are these trees getting water from their roots all the way up their trunk to the tip top of their leaves? And look at the size of these things compared to like an apple tree or a 10-story building, right? It's amazing that they can get water all the way up there. What is the process? How is this occurring? So there's kind of two steps, right? The first that we need to consider is, how do we get water from the soil into the root? And then the second is, once it's in the roots, how do we get it to travel up the plant? So if we look at that first step, right, how's water getting into the root? What's occurring is that mineral ions are pumped into the root cells through a process called active transport. And we're taking ions from the soil, we're pumping them into our root cells, and this creates a concentration gradient where now there's more solute or ions within the cell than outside of the cells. And again, if you remember from osmosis, we'll go back a couple right here, right? So they're pumping these ions. We'll pretend this is the cell membrane, this is outside the cell, this is in the cell. We're pumping ions across the cell membrane to create this concentration gradient, where now we have a lot of ions, a lot of solute in our cell, not a lot on the outside of our cell. And through this process of osmosis, this natural process, water is naturally going to flow from now outside of the cell into our cell. All right, so that's the first step. That's how water is getting into our root. Now, once it's in our root, it's going to travel through the root to the xylem. And remember, the xylem is that vascular tissue. It's what transports water. It's made up of those xylem vessels, or those tracheids. It's kind of like they kind of form like a straw, right? So, and it's on the interior of our root. So our water is going to have to travel from the outside of our root to the interior of the root. And it does that through two ways: apoplastic movement or symplastic movement. Really what this means is apoplastic movement is movement outside of the cells. So the water gets into the root and then it's going to travel through, essentially it's traveling through the cell walls towards the center of the root. Whereas symplastic movement is happening, that water is traveling within the cell. So it's traveling within the cytoplasm and across those plasmodesmata, the little bridges that connect cell to cell. Eventually, if the water is going to get into the xylem, it's going to have to go through this symplastic movement. You guys, I don't know if you remember, but if we're looking at the structure of our root, right, we have the epidermis that has the root hairs, and then we have the cortex, and before we get to the interior of our root, we have the endodermis, which is the kind of inner part of the cortex. And that endodermis has what we refer to as a Casparian strip. It's this waterproof strip. So any water that is moving through our root, through that apoplastic movement, just kind of moving along this gradient through cell walls, it's going to hit that Casparian strip and it's not going to be able to move further into the root. So in order to get into the actual interior of the root, into the xylem, it's going to need to go through a cell, and that is this symplastic movement. Right, so our water makes its way through the exterior of the root, goes to the interior root, it gets into the xylem. Initially, there may be some positive root pressure. That's that positive pressure that's going to push water up the xylem. But really, the main force that is going to move the water from the xylem in the root up to the top of the plant is this negative water potential that's created from our leaves transpiring. So our leaves evaporating water. That's really essentially draws the water up. So let's take a look. And we refer to this as the transpiration stream, right? And it starts essentially, or the driver essentially, is at the leaves. So water is going to evaporate from the outer surfaces of the mesophyll cells in leaves. All right, so water is evaporating from our leaves. They're evaporating through those stomata, right? As water is lost through those stomata, those little openings that you see here. As water is lost, it creates a water potential difference between now these dry mesophyll cells that we see here and adjacent moist cells. Now water, because we have this water potential, this gradient, and we have this loss of water here, it begins to pull water from the moist cells that are adjacent to it, right? So we have water that's being lost through the stomata, through these cells, and as these cells are becoming dry, they're pulling the moisture of adjacent cells into them and rehydrating them. Now, due to that process, or those properties of water, that adhesion and cohesion, importantly, as we're pulling water into adjacent cells, those water cells are dragging along other water molecules. Water molecules are dragging along other water molecules that you see here, right? And this occurs all the way down throughout the entire plant, through the xylem, right? So we're at the tippy top of our leaves, and water molecules are being evaporated or transpiring through the stomata. As those are leaving, it pulls along other water molecules through that process of cohesion, and that works all the way down the trunk, all the way to the roots. Right? So it's really the loss of water at our leaves that is going to pull water molecules all the way up through the xylem. And we refer to this as the transpiration stream. So that's water movement, right? And it's really important to understand how water moves through our plants. Now, I mentioned a little bit already some of this stuff when we're going to shift now and talk about mineral transport. So plant nutrients are charged forms of elements. And we refer to them, and when they are charged forms, we refer to them as ions. Now, just like with water, ions can move through the cells, through plant cells, either through that apoplastic movement, which is kind of along these cell walls, or through that symplastic movement, which is through the cells. And eventually, they're going to have to go through that symplastic movement once they reach this Casparian strip. Now, because the solute concentration is often higher, or the ion concentration is often higher within these cells than outside of the cell in the root, minerals need to get pumped into the cell through active transport. And again, I talked about that when I talked about how water initially gets into the root, right? It's through that osmosis, because there's all of these solutes in here that water is naturally going to flow through. Well, to get these ions in, we have to pump them in through this process of active transport. And essentially, that just means that it requires energy in order to pump these in. They won't just naturally flow across. So, when we are talking about minerals, there are 17 essential elements needed by plants for their growth, development, and function. Or 17 elements. Carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen are the big three, and they comprise greater than 95% of the dry weight of the plant, right? And then we obtain carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen from the air and water. The remaining elements are referred to as mineral nutrients, and they are going to come from the soil, right? So we need 17 essential elements for our plant. Carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen are coming from the air and water. The remaining are mineral nutrients that we're getting from the soil. Now we can break down those 14 mineral nutrients into macronutrients and micronutrients. Now, macronutrients are used in the largest amount. Think of macro as big. And within macros, we can further break them down into primary and secondary. Micronutrients are used in smaller amounts, right? And if we're looking, and then we are using smaller amounts. Now, there is what they refer to as the law of minimum. So even if you don't need a lot of these micronutrients, or need a lot in terms of quantity, you still need some. If you are deficient in any of them, your plant is going to be deficient and it will not grow and develop properly, right? So even if you don't need a lot of these micronutrients, they're still important. But if we're talking about what nutrients you need the most of, you need macronutrients, and within those macronutrients, you typically are concerned with your primary nutrients. It is these big three, NPK, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, that our plants require the most of. And typically when you look at your fertilizers, it's this NPK value that you're going to see, right? Because typically you'll be deficient, or the addition of these is going to help your plants grow because they're required in the largest amounts. So nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium are the big three, your three main primary nutrients. But then your secondary macronutrients include calcium, magnesium, and sulfur. And then your more micronutrients that you don't need as much are boron, copper, chlorine, iron, manganese, molybdenum, nickel, and zinc. I always have a struggle pronouncing that. I probably pronounce it wrong, but you get the idea. Okay, so besides just needing those elements, some other things to take note of is that certain elements have interacting effects. Right, so you can have a positive interaction. In this case, potassium uptake can be enhanced by adding calcium to the soil. Or you can have an antagonistic interaction where calcium and magnesium are antagonistic. So an excess of one can lead to a deficiency in other. So your minerals can interact in kind of unique ways. Element mobility is another important factor. So mobile elements are those that the plant can translocate from one area to another. And this is really important when we start looking in the next couple slides at deficiencies. So your deficiencies will show up on lower leaves and tissues first, because the element is able to relocate to the younger growing areas of the plant. So you have your plant growing, right? And your older leaves are on the bottom, your younger leaves are on the top, right? Because your plant grows, that's how the plant grows. So if you have elements that are mobile, if you are deficient in that element for NPK, so say we're deficient in nitrogen with our plant, As that plant is growing, those new young leaves need nitrogen to grow and develop properly. What the plant is able to do is it's able to take some of the nitrogen from the old leaves, the older leaves that are on the bottom, and translocate that, move that nitrogen up to the new growing leaves that need them. So, because of this, as that deficiency increases, you will start to see the signs of that deficiency at the old lower leaves because it's there first that the plant is taking those nutrients and moving them up to the younger growing leaves. And if we have immobile elements, the opposite is true. You will see your deficiencies first at your upper leaves. So, we're going to briefly talk about these big three: nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. So nitrogen, because they're the three kind of most important. And again, you need all the minerals, that law of minimum, but these are kind of the three most important, at least in terms of quantity that you need. So nitrogen is found in all proteins. It is a very, very important element. It's part of DNA, RNA, it's part of ATP that we'll learn about, NADPH and NADH, two other molecules very important for photosynthesis. So nitrogen, very, very important molecule. And plants require large amounts of nitrogen. Because of this, it is often the most commonly deficient element in plant growing systems. Now, nitrogen is very, very abundant in air. Most of the atmosphere is composed of nitrogen, but there's low availability in soil. But our plants are able to absorb and utilize two forms of nitrogen: ammonium or nitrate, that are found in soil. So there is what we refer to as a nitrogen cycle, which essentially shows the transfer of nitrogen between air and soil and organisms. What you should be aware of is that the way that we get fixed nitrogen, so we get nitrogen from the air into a element that can be taken in by the plant, is primarily two ways. We have the decay of living tissue, right? So we have living tissue that dies and it breaks down, and it produces ammonium decay, and that gets converted into this nitrate here, and that can be taken up by plants. Or we have fixation of nitrogen by bacteria found often growing on the roots of plants, nitrogen-fixing bacteria, and they're growing on the roots of legumes, and we'll look at that. Right? Those are kind of the two big ways that we can get nitrogen from either the atmosphere or an organism and get it into the soil and into our plants. Now, I mentioned nitrogen-fixing bacteria. These are very, very important. They are typically bacteria found in the genus Rhizobia, and they infect legumes. And they form growths on the nodule, or they form growths on the roots called nodules, and you see them there. Now, these bacteria have a symbiotic relationship with our plants. All right, so the plant is going to supply the bacteria with some carbohydrates that the bacteria can use to consume and turn into energy. And the bacteria, in turn, supplies the plant with ammonium, right? It's going to supply it with the source of nitrogen. Now, species of Rhizobia are specific to particular crops, right? So your pea Rhizobia won't necessarily form nodules on bean plants, and vice versa. And if you are going to be planting, it's important to supply an inoculant when a legume is first grown on a field, right? So you want to make sure, and you can buy these commercially, you want to make sure that within your field you have these nitrogen-fixing bacteria in order to form this association with your plants. Now, in the early 1900s, there was a process that was developed to fix nitrogen from the air artificially, not using bacteria, right? And this is referred to as the Haber-Bosch process. And it is an incredibly important process because it's how we make our artificial fertilizers, right? Beforehand, if we needed nitrogen, some of the big natural fertilizers were like guano, bat poop, right? Because they were high in nitrogen. And we didn't have a way to actually take nitrogen from the air and turn it into a type of um, element or molecule that we can then supply to our plants until this process. So what they're doing is you use heat and high pressure to fix nitrogen from the air with methane, and you produce a liquid ammonia. And then that ammonia is mixed into chemical fertilizers, and bam, now you have a fertilizer that you can apply to your plants. So this is the process by which we create our chemical fertilizers. Today, chemical fertilizers contribute to about half of the nitrogen input in global agriculture. Now, this process is very energy intensive and expensive, but it's also likely led to the current population explosion on the Earth. And now there are, good and bad aspects of this, right? If we go all the way back to the beginning of the course when we were talking about sustainable agriculture, the large-scale monocultures that we've seen developed since World War II and that process of large-scale monoculture, heavy fertilizer to boost productivity is really only possible through this process. And if we look long-term, whether that is a good thing or a bad thing, I think can be debated, right? We've seen positives of that type of agriculture in terms of, at least in the short term, producing a lot, increasing yields. But we've also seen a lot of negatives, such as loss of topsoil, loss of biodiversity, loss of mineral nutrition, and really the need to increasingly add more and more fertilizer. So it's an incredibly important process, and it can be debated in terms of ultimately kind of good or bad. But it's important to know. Okay, so last thing we are going to talk about are signs of deficiencies. So if we're looking at nitrogen, the signs of nitrogen deficiency are a yellowing of leaves, first found on the lower leaves, again, because this is a mobile nutrient, and then gradually, if the deficiency remains, increasing to the upper leaves. So you see that yellowing, and your growth will be stunted. That's a sign of nitrogen deficiency. If we talk about phosphorus, phosphorus, again, is an incredibly important element for our plants, used in a number of ways. It is generally, after nitrogen, the second most limiting element for plant growth. Most phosphorus is tied up in our organic material, and it's also affected by soil pH, right? So soil pH, we don't get into much right here, but soil pH is important because it affects the ability of plants to uptake certain minerals, right? Certain minerals are soluble or available to be taken up by plants at a lower pH. Some are more soluble at a higher pH. So that can affect, like I said, what can be taken up by the plant, and can create deficiencies if you have, depending on what your soil is, your pH of your soil is. But we'll get into that, and if you take plant propagation, we go more into it in depth there. So phosphorus tied up in organic material. Mycorrhizae, that fungi that forms those associations with our plant roots, are helpful in helping our plants absorb phosphorus. If we're looking at deficiencies, this is kind of an easy one to spot. Like nitrogen, your deficiencies are first going to show up in your lower leaves. We see here. And the telltale sign is this dark kind of purple color that can appear on your leaves. And your plants may become spindly. And then the last of the big three there, potassium, is critical for the control of stomata opening and closing. It's actually potassium that flows in and out of vacuoles that leads to the stomata opening and closing. It's also required for the activation of many enzymes. It is more plentiful in soil than nitrogen or phosphorus, but it's not easily leached from the soil. Oh, it's more plentiful and not easily leached, so it's not easily kind of leached out through waterfall. You will see potassium deficiency. Like with nitrogen, you'll see a yellowing, but you'll typically start seeing it on the leaf edge as opposed to the whole leaf. That is more common in our nitrogen deficiency. And then some other kind of nutrient deficiencies that you may see. Calcium, again, is a secondary macronutrient, so it's important, but not as important. I say important, but you don't need as much of it as those nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus. But some kind of common nutrient deficiencies you may see is tip burn in lettuce, where the ends of your lettuce leaves get soft and kind of rotten. Blossom end rot in tomatoes, right? You may see that develop. That is a sign of a calcium deficiency. Magnesium, another important macronutrient, is kind of neat. The deficiency you see is interveinal chlorosis, or a yellowing of the leaves between the leaf veins, right? If you have a low magnesium. You will also see this in an iron deficiency, but the big difference here is iron is not a mobile element. So because magnesium is a mobile element, you will see this start. You will first see this deficiency on the lower leaves, right? Because the newer leaves, the plant is taking the magnesium from the old leaves, bringing it to the top. Those old leaves are going to show signs of deficiency. With iron, is not mobile. So the plant isn't able to take the iron in the older leaves and move it to the new leaves. So you see the deficiency here start on the younger top leaves. Last thing to note, many plants show similar symptoms to multiple nutrient deficiencies, as well as some other plant diseases and disorders. So it's not always easy to just do a visual inspection and determine what is lacking. You should test your leaves and your soil to get a better understanding of what deficiencies you may have. And plants showing kind of nitrogen deficiencies, it may, like I said, there may be other issues than a lack of nitrogen. You may have too much nitrogen, you may have a root issue, you may have a lack of water, so your plant's not able to uptake minerals because those stomata are closed, and that transpiration stream is shut off. So it may be other issues in play as well, other than the amount of mineral nutrients in your soil. Okay, last thing. I thought that was the last. Here's the last thing. Plants, particularly our annuals, will allocate resources to their seeds from other tissues and organs, right? And this is called remobilization. So when it switches to that reproductive mode, it's going to put all of its energy and its mineral nutrients towards reproducing, and it shifts that from its vegetative tissues to its reproductive tissues to its seeds. So during reproductive development, some plants are able to remobilize that NP and K, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, from their vegetative tissues to their reproductive tissues. For example, by 120 days after emergence, most of that NPK and soybean tissue has been translocated to the beans, right? So that whatever was in the vegetative tissues has been moved to the actual soybeans. And this occurs in plants that have vegetative dieback at some point. Again, this is typically of our annuals. So by harvest time, for example, corn stalks, apple leaves, grape leaves have very low concentrations of NPK and typically won't supply adequate amounts of nutrients to the soil by themselves, right? Because they've been relocated to the reproductive tissues. And not all nutrients go to the fruit or seeds. If we're talking about different plants, maybe our perennials or biennials, those nutrients can get translocated to the roots or stem as storage structures. And that should be it. It is. All right, so that was a little overview of water and mineral nutrition.